Society does not forgive a woman who sits still. It forgives beauty without wit, and wit without beauty. But a woman who simply sits, who neither preens nor performs, is treated as a piece of furniture, until the one man in the room who has stopped believing in performances finally notices the only person not putting one on. Chapter 1. The House of Three Cousins. Thornfield Rectory was a small stone house at the edge of a small stone village, and for 8 years it had held 3 young women under one roof who could not have been less alike if they had been drawn from 3 different novels. There was Beatrice, the eldest, golden-haired and radiant, the acknowledged beauty of 3 counties, who had been raised by her mother, the rector's sister-in-law, a widow of considerable vanity, to understand that her face was a fortune to be spent wisely and soon. There was Cecilia, a year younger, dark and quick, whose tongue could flay a man at 20 paces, and who had read every novel in the county circulating library twice, the second time to find fault with the first. And there was Margaret, the rector's own daughter, the quietest of the 3, who had been 8 years old when a spring carriage accident on the Bath Road killed her mother and left her with a leg that never fully forgave the injury. The 3 girls had grown up together, tangled in the particular closeness and cruelty that only cousins raised as sisters can produce. Beatrice and Cecilia loved Margaret the way one loves a piece of furniture that has always been in the room, with a fondness too old and too careless to require any actual attention. They did not think of themselves as unkind. They simply did not think of Margaret much at all, and Margaret, for her part, had long ago stopped expecting them to. "You will come to the harvest ball, of course," Beatrice said one September afternoon, examining her reflection in the parlor glass with the seriousness of a general reviewing troops. "Mother says the new colonel is to attend. Lady Rutherford's son. He inherited everything when his elder brother died at Trafalgar, and he is unmarried, and he is said to be worth 11,000 a year." "I have no interest in colonels," Cecilia said from the window seat, not looking up from her book. "I have interest in men who can hold a conversation about something other than horses and Bonaparte, though I suppose a war hero might at least have interesting scars to discuss." "He does have a scar," Beatrice said, delighted. "Along the ribs, Mrs. Fenwick says, from a musket ball at Pedagio's. Terribly romantic." Margaret sat in the corner, mending the hem of Beatrice's second-best gown, and said nothing at all. She had long since learned that conversations about balls did not require her participation, only her needle, since it was always Margaret who did the mending, Margaret who did the small, unglamorous labor that kept her cousins glittering, while she herself remained, by unspoken family consensus, unglamorous by design. Nobody had ever said to her face that a rector's lame daughter had no business competing for a colonel's attention. Nobody had needed to. It was simply understood, the way the weather was understood, a fact of the household that required no discussion, and Margaret had built her entire adult life around the quiet architecture of that understanding, never asking for the front-facing chair at church, never expecting to be asked to dance, never allowing herself the small, dangerous luxury of wanting to be looked at. "You'll come, Margaret," Cecilia said, finally looking up, not unkindly. "You always come. You can sit with Aunt Frances and watch. You like watching." It was true. Margaret did like watching. She had made a private study, over the years, of the way people behave when they believe themselves unobserved by anyone who mattered, the calculating tilt of a mother's head as she assessed a daughter's rivals, the particular falseness of a laugh aimed at a wealthy man. the small cruelties tucked inside compliments. She had grown, without quite intending to, into a shrewd and silent observer of a world that had stopped expecting anything of her, and there was, she had discovered, a strange freedom in being expected to offer nothing. No one watched her face for disappointment. No one measured her against a rival. She was simply there, the way the fern in the ballroom corner was there, and she had made her peace with it years ago, or told herself she had. "I like watching," she agreed mildly, and bit off the thread. Chapter 2. The Harvest Ball. The Fairmorn Ballroom was ablaze with candlelight on the night of the Harvest Ball, 600 beeswax tapers burning above 600 pounds of orchestra and gossip, and every mother in Hampshire had dressed her daughter like a prize heifer and marched her onto the floor. Beatrice wore blue silk that matched her eyes exactly, a fact her mother had spent 4 months in considerable expense arranging with the modiste. Cecilia wore green, sharper and more severe than fashion strictly dictated, because she had declared plain fashion a form of surrender and meant to be noticeable even if she could not, in her own estimation, compete with Beatrice for beauty. Margaret wore a grey dress 3 seasons old, taken in at the waist by her own hand, and took her customary chair against the eastern wall, half hidden behind a potted fern that the housekeeper had placed there years ago, and no one had ever thought to move. Her leg ached tonight. It always ached when the weather turned, and the autumn damp had settled into the old injury like a familiar, unwelcome guest. She watched the swirl of silk and epaulets with the detached interest of a woman studying a painting she did not particularly like but could not look away from, and she watched, in particular, her cousins begin their evening's careful campaign. Beatrice arranged herself near the punch table, where the light from the chandelier fell most flatteringly, and laughed at every remark made in her vicinity with a musical, practiced trill that she had perfected over 3 seasons of assemblies. Cecilia positioned herself near a cluster of older, more intellectually serious gentlemen, dropping references to Wordsworth and the Corn Laws with the precision of a woman firing a rifle, watching each man's face with a flicker of impressed surprise that meant she had scored a hit. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the noise of the room dipped, the way it always did when someone important arrived. Colonel James Rutherford had not wanted to come. He had returned from the peninsula 11 months ago with a musket ball scar along his ribs and a silence in him that peacetime had not yet managed to fill. His mother, Lady Rutherford, had dragged him to every ball of the season with the singular, unrelenting mission of seeing him married before Christmas, and he had endured her campaign the way he had once endured long marches through Spanish mud, with grim, wordless compliance, because arguing cost more than simply enduring. He crossed the room mechanically, bowing to the appropriate matrons, and within a quarter hour had been introduced to no fewer than 9 young women, each presented to him by an eager mother the way a horse trader presents a particularly fine mare. He danced with 2 of them out of obligation. Beatrice was the third, secured by her mother's determined maneuvering near the receiving line, and she danced beautifully, laughed at the correct intervals, and told him 3 times how very interesting his war stories must be without once asking him to relate one. "You must have seen such extraordinary things, Colonel," she said, as they turned through the figures of a country dance. "I do so admire a man who has *lived star." "I have seen mud, mostly," James said, "and men dying of fevers that had nothing romantic about them at all." Beatrice's smile did not falter, but her eyes flickered, briefly and unmistakably, toward a group of officers by the door, calculating whether her next partner might prove a more rewarding investment of her evening. James noted it. He noted, too, the practiced quality of every laugh in the room, the way each woman he was introduced to seemed to be reciting from an identical, well-rehearsed script. Asterisk, how interesting, how brave, how very tired you must be from your travels, asterisk, as though bravery and fatigue were topics to be managed rather than actually discussed. He danced with Cecilia next, at his mother's urging, and found her at least more original in her performance. She discussed the corn laws with genuine passion, quoted a review of a new volume of poetry, and asked him 3 sharp questions about the conduct of the war in Spain that were better informed than any he had been asked all evening. "You have opinions," James said, mildly startled. "I have several," Cecilia said. "I keep most of them to myself in mixed company, as I am told they are unbecoming. Tonight I have decided to be unbecoming on purpose, as an experiment, to see whether the Colonel finds it more or less tedious in the alternative." "Less," James admitted, and meant it. But even Cecilia, for all her sharpness, watched his face too closely after every remark, gauging his reaction, adjusting her performance according to what she saw there, a fencer testing his guard, not a woman simply talking. He recognized it because he had spent a decade learning to read exactly that kind of calculation on a battlefield, where misjudging an opponent's next move could cost a man his life. He was tired, bone-tired, of being read and managed and performed at, even by someone as genuinely clever as Cecilia. He excused himself after the dance and retreated toward the edge of the room to breathe. That was when he saw her. Chapter 3. The Fern. The woman by the fern was not preening. She was not glancing toward him with practised hope, nor calculating the angle of the candlelight, nor rehearsing an opening remark about his scar. She was watching the dance floor the way he might watch a battlefield, cataloguing, assessing, entirely unbothered by his presence 8 feet away. She had a plain, sensible face that became, on second look, quietly striking, a strong jaw, watchful gray eyes, dark hair pinned back without ornament, and a stillness about her that stood out precisely because everything else in the room was in constant, anxious motion. "You are not dancing," he said, before he had decided to speak at all. She toned, unhurried, betraying no surprise that a colonel had addressed her without introduction. "No, sir, nor are you, apparently, for the last 10 minutes. I am recovering from dancing or from being looked at." The directness startled a short laugh out of him, rusty, unpracticed, the first entirely unplanned sound he had made all evening. "Both, I think. Then we have that in common." She did not smile invitingly, the way Beatrice had smiled, nor did she watch to see whether her remark had landed well, the way Cecilia had watched. She simply stated it, the way one might remark on the weather, and returned her attention to the floor, apparently content to let the conversation end there if he chose. He found that he did not choose to let it end there. He sat, uninvited, in the empty chair beside her. "May I ask your name?" "Miss Margaret Ashworth. My father is a rector at Thornfield. My cousins are the 2 young ladies you have already danced with this evening, Miss Beatrice Hale, in the blue, and Miss Cecilia Hale, in the green. You are cousin to both. I have that misfortune, or that fortune, depending on the week." A faint, dry humor moved at the corner of her mouth, gone almost before he registered it. They are both very accomplished. I am told it is remarkable that 3 girls raised in the same house turned out so entirely different. And which are you, if not accomplished? I am the one who mends the hams, Margaret said. It is a less celebrated accomplishment, but a necessary one. James found himself sitting there considerably longer than propriety strictly required, watching his mother's eye catch his own from across the room and narrow with a mixture of confusion and hope that he chose, for once, to ignore entirely. A rector's daughter, hiding behind a fern at the season's grandest ball. Someone has to hide there. It would be a terrible waste of a very good fern otherwise. He laughed again, louder this time, throwing a second glance from his mother. They talked, or rather, he found himself talking, which was itself unusual, about the crossing at Pedagio's and the cold at Corunna, things he had told no one, not even his mother, who wanted only to hear that he was recovered and happy, and certainly not Beatrice, who wanted only a picturesque anecdote she could repeat at the next assembly. Margaret did not flinch at the details, did not offer soft platitudes, did not perform sympathy for his benefit. She asked precise questions, how the men kept their powder dry in the rain, whether the surgeons had enough laudanum, whether it was true that the retreat to Corunna had been as disorderly as the newspapers implied, the kind of questions that treated him like a man who had survived something specific and real, not a curiosity to be managed or a romantic figure to be admired. "You should ask me to dance," she said eventually, when the orchestra struck up a waltz. "It is customary." "I would like to, but I suspect you would refuse me." "I would. I do not dance." "May I ask why?" She held his gaze, and for the first time all evening, something in her composure shifted, not embarrassment, but a visible decision to be honest rather than easy, the kind of decision he recognized because he had made it himself only a minute before, telling her about Corunna. A carriage accident 8 years ago. My mother died in it. My leg does not bear the turns well. I have found it simpler to remove the question entirely than to explain it to every man who asks, and simpler still to let my cousins assume I have no interest in dancing at all, which spares everyone an awkward conversation. "That is not simpler," James said quietly. "That is merely quieter." "Is there a difference?" "There is every difference. Quiet is what you have been doing all evening, while your cousins have been performing. I would rather ask you something you can actually say yes to." She waited, watching him with an attention that felt, for the first time all night, entirely undivided. "Will you walk with me?" "On the terrace. I am told the injury minds a straight line considerably better than a waltz." Margaret studied him for a long moment, long enough that he began to suspect he had misjudged the whole evening, and then she rose, steadying herself briefly on the arm of the chair, and said, "That, Colonel, I can manage." Chapter 4. The Terrace. They walked the length of the terrace twice, then a third time, while the ball glittered on behind the glass doors, its noise and its dancing continuing without either of them. He did not offer his arm out of pity. She did not take it out of need, though after the second turn she accepted it without comment, and he adjusted his pace without her having to ask, matching his steady, uneven rhythm as naturally as if he had always walked that way. "Everyone in that room will have decided by morning that I have made a fool of myself," Margaret said, looking out over the dark garden. A colonel does not spend 3/4 of an hour with the rector's lame cousin for any respectable reason, when there are two considerably more eligible Hale sisters in the same room. Then let them decide it, James said. I have spent 4 years being decided about, brave, wounded, tragic, recovering. Tonight alone I have been told twice how interesting my scar must be, as though it were a piece of embroidery I had chosen to wear. I find I would rather spend an evening simply talking to someone who lets me finish a sentence without composing her next remark while I speak. I make no claims to being easy company. My cousin Cecilia would tell you I am dull. My cousin Beatrice would tell you I am practical, which in her mouth means the same thing. No, he agreed. You make no claims at all. That is precisely the difficulty. I find I cannot stop noticing you specifically because you are not asking to be noticed. Your cousins are both, in their own ways, remarkable women, but I could feel them watching my face and my reaction to everything they said, the way one watches a card table. You have not once done that. Perhaps I simply do not care what you think of me. Do you? Margaret was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost some of its dry composure. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I do, which is inconvenient, as I fully expect you to return to London by Christmas and marry someone considerably more decorative than myself, and I would rather not have spent the evening caring what a man thought of me only to watch him vanish. I have no plans to vanish, James said. I find London considerably less interesting than a fern, at present. She laughed, a real laugh, low and startled out of her, entirely unlike the practiced trill he had heard from Beatrice all evening, and something in his chest loosened at the sound of it, a knot he had been carrying, he realized, since Corunna. Chapter 5. The Rectory. The season continued for 6 more weeks, and James called the rectory with a regularity that set the entire village whispering. He came first with the excuse of returning a book Margaret had mentioned on the terrace, a volume of Cowper's poetry her father owned. He stayed for tea. He came again the following week with no excuse at all, and was received in the small, shabby parlor by Mrs. Hale, Beatrice, and Cecilia's mother, who greeted him with confused delight, assuming, as did everyone in the household except Margaret herself, that his visits were some elaborate approach toward one of her own daughters. Colonel Rutherford, Mrs. Hale said, ushering him into the parlor with visible excitement. Beatrice will be down directly. She has just this morning had a new bonnet arrive from Bath, the most becoming shade of. I had hoped, if it is not an imposition, to speak with Miss Margaret Ashworth, James said. I understand she is fond of Cowper, and I wish to return a favor of conversation. The silence that followed this remark was, in its way, more eloquent than any speech Mrs. Hale might have delivered. Beatrice, arriving in the doorway in her new bonnet a moment later, absorbed the situation with visible and unconcealed astonishment, and Cecilia, coming down the stairs behind her with the book still in hand, actually laughed aloud, a short, surprised bark of amusement that she did not bother to disguise. Well, Cecilia said, that is certainly not the outcome anyone predicted at the harvest ball. Margaret, summoned from the kitchen garden where she had been cutting herbs for her father's evening tisane, entered still wearing her gardening apron and with dote on her hands, and found the entire household arranged around the parlor staring at her as though she had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. "Colonel Rutherford has come to discuss Cowper," Mrs. Hale said faintly. "Has he?" Margaret said, and something in her voice, dry, unimpressed, entirely herself even in the face of her family's astonishment, made James want, quite badly, to laugh. He called every week thereafter, then twice a week, then, by November, nearly every day that his estate business did not require him elsewhere. He brought books. He brought, once, a small dog he had rescued from a tenant's barn, simply because he thought Margaret might like it, and she did, fiercely and immediately, in a way that told him more about the size of the heart she kept so carefully guarded than any conversation could have. She named the dog Wellington, over James's mild protest that it was disrespectful to the general, and the dog followed her everywhere thereafter, curling against her uneven leg each evening as though he understood, in his animal way, that it needed the extra warmth. He asked her opinion on the tenant disputes at Ashcombe, his estate, on the letters from his solicitor regarding a boundary quarrel with a neighboring landowner, on whether a man who had seen what he had seen at Bedardio's could ever properly explain it to a woman who had not, and found, each time, that she answered as though the question deserved a real answer, not a comforting one. "You must move the eastern hedge line," Margaret told him one afternoon in her father's study, examining a survey map he had brought her almost as an excuse to visit. "Your steward has drawn the boundary along the old path, but the old path was cut before the stream shifted its course in the flood of '9. If your tenant Hobbs is complaining that his lower field floods every spring, it is because your boundary line no longer follows the actual water." James stared at the map, then at her. "How do you know the stream shifted in '9? "Because I was 8 years old and it flooded the rectory kitchen, and my father has complained about it every spring since. People remember floods. Colonel, they rarely think to redraw their maps to match." He redrew the boundary the following week, exactly as she had suggested, and Hobbs's flooding ceased entirely by spring, a small, unglamorous fact that meant more to James than any of the elaborate compliments he had received all season, because it was true, and because she had given it to him without any performance of cleverness at all, simply as a fact that needed stating. Beatrice, meanwhile, watched the colonel's continued visits to the rectory with confusion that slowly curdled into something sharper. She had never wanted James Rutherford with any particular depth of feeling. He was, to her, primarily a fortune and a title, one of several such prospects she had been cultivating that season, but she found she could not bear the specific insult of having been passed over for Margaret, whom she had spent 8 years regarding, without much thought, as a household quiet, unremarkable shadow. "I do not understand it," Beatrice said one evening, brushing her hair before the parlor glass with more force than the task required. "She has nothing, no fortune, no accomplishments, no conversation to speak of. She mends hams, Cecilia. She has spent 8 years mending our hams." "Perhaps," Cecilia said, not looking up from a book, "the colonel has simply had enough of women who spend their evenings watching to see what he thinks of them, and has found, in our cousin, someone who does not particularly care." "That is absurd. Every woman cares what a man of 11,000 a year thinks of her." "Margaret has never cared what anyone thought of her, Beatrice. It is, I begin to suspect, the single most interesting thing about her, and we were both too busy watching ourselves in mirrors to ever notice it." Beatrice set down her brush with unusual force and said nothing further, but the sharpness did not leave her. Chapter 6. The Storm. It was in late January, during the deepest cold of that hard winter, that the trouble at Ashcombe brought the two families together under the same roof, and, in doing so, brought the season's simmering resentments to a head. James's mother had invited the entire Hale household to stay a week at Ashcombe, ostensibly to celebrate the New Year, though everyone understood the invitation to be, in truth, an inspection of the family Margaret would soon be marrying into. The rectory party arrived on a bitter Tuesday, the roads half-frozen, and by Thursday evening the sky over the Hampshire Downs had turned the colour of a bruise. "There's a storm coming," James said, standing at the tall windows of the drawing-room, watching the clouds pile up black over the western hills. "A bad one, I think. Old Hobbs said as much this morning. His knee troubles him before weather, and it has been troubling him since Tuesday." The storm broke that night with a violence that surprised even the estate's oldest servants. Wind screamed down from the downs and threw itself against the old house, and somewhere near midnight, with a crack like a gunshot, one of the tall nursery windows on the northern side blew inward entirely, showering the room with glass and letting in a horizontal blast of sleet and freezing wind. The nursery had been empty of children for a decade, used now mainly for storage, but it shared a wall with the housekeeper's small sitting-room, where old Mrs. Pruitt, Ashcombe's housekeeper of 30 years, had gone to bank the fire for the night. The force of the blown window and the sudden violent draught brought down a section of loose plaster from the shared ceiling directly above her chair. Margaret heard the crash from her guest room 2 doors down and was in the corridor, wrapped only in her shawl, before she had properly finished thinking about it. James reached the nursery at nearly the same moment, having taken the back stairs 2 at a time, his bad leg forgotten entirely in the surge of old battlefield instinct. He found Mrs. Pruitt conscious but pinned beneath a fallen ceiling beam, her sitting-room half buried in plaster and freezing wind screaming through the open nursery door beyond. "The beam," James said, already moving. "I need something to brace it, anything solid." "The linen press in the corridor," Margaret said, already turning. "It is oak. It will hold longer than anything else on this floor." Beatrice and Cecilia arrived in the doorway a moment later, roused by the noise, and stood frozen, Beatrice with her hand pressed to her mouth, Cecilia pale but steady, both of them staring at the scene with the particular helplessness of people who had never once, in their lives, been asked to do anything more physically demanding than embroidery. "Fetch the footman," James ordered over his shoulder. "Both of you, now, and bring rope from the stable if you can find it in the dark." Beatrice ran. Cecilia, after a single steadying breath, ran with her. Margaret dragged the linen press herself, with scraping against stone, her leg screaming its old protest with every step, and together she and James wedged it beneath the sagging beam, buying precious inches of clearance. James knelt in the freezing debris and worked his hands beneath Mrs. Pruitt's shoulders, testing whether she could be moved. "My hip," the old woman gasped. "I cannot feel my hip, Colonel." "Do not move her further," Margaret said sharply, dropping to her knees in the plaster dust beside them, her hands already moving with the same brisk, unhurried competence she had once brought to a survey map. "Not until we know what is broken. James, hold the beam." I will see to her. He looked at her, kneeling in the wreckage, sleet blowing in sideways from the shattered nursery window, giving him orders in a voice that carried not one trace of panic, and felt something in his chest crack open entirely, the last guarded piece of it, the part that had spent 11 months since Corona waiting for someone, ainage, to simply asterisk act asterisk instead of performing action for an audience. The footman arrived within minutes, Beatrice and Cecilia close behind them, and between the 6 of them the beam was properly braced. Mrs. Pruitt was gently extracted and carried to a warm room below, and the shattered nursery window was, at Margaret's direction, sealed with a length of canvas dragged from the stables and nailed fast against the howling wind. It was well past 2 in the morning before the household settled again. James found Margaret afterward in the kitchen, sitting alone by the bank fire, her hands raw and reddened from the cold and the rope, a streak of plaster dust still white across her cheek. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly, crossing the room to kneel before her chair and take her cold hand in his. "You gave orders to a room full of frightened people as though you had commanded troops your whole life. I have spent 8 years managing crises no one else in that house wished to see," Margaret said. "A broken hedge, a flooded kitchen, a cousin's tears before an assembly. It is not so very different, in the end, from a falling beam. One simply decides what needs doing, and does it, and does not waste time being frightened until afterward. And are you frightened now?" Her composure, held so steadily through the last 2 hours, finally, quietly broke, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, her raw hands gripping the front of his coat. "Terribly," she admitted, muffled. "Mrs. Pruitt might have died. You might have been hurt reaching her. I have spent so long deciding not to feel things loudly that I hardly know how to do it, even now." "You do not have to do it loudly," James murmured into her hair. "You never have. That has never been the thing I loved about you." It was the first time either of them had said the word aloud, and it settled into the warm, bank-fire quiet of the kitchen as though it had always belonged there. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The events of that night changed something in the house that no dinner conversation could have managed alone. Beatrice, who had run through a freezing corridor at Margaret's shouted instruction without a second thought, found she could no longer quite hold on to the careless resentment she had nursed all winter, and it was Beatrice herself, 3 days later, who finally raised a subject that had gone unspoken since September. She found Margaret alone in the small morning room, writing a letter to her father, and closed the door behind her with unusual care. "I have not been kind to you," Beatrice said, without preamble, twisting her hand together in a manner entirely unlike her usual composed elegance. "Not this winter, and not, I think, in 8 years before it. I called you nothing at that dinner in November, in front of the Colonel and his mother, and I have thought of it every day since with considerable shame." Margaret set down her pen. "You were unhappy. I understood it well enough at the time. That is no excuse. You have spent 8 years mending my hems and asking nothing in return, and I repaid it by trying to humiliate you at a dinner table because I could not bear that a man had finally chosen you over me. I do not know how to say I am sorry in a way that undoes it." "You do not need to undo it," Margaret said, and there was no coldness in her voice, only the same steady, watchful honesty she had given James on the terrace in September. I have spent a great many years believing that being overlooked was simply the shape of my life, Beatrice, and that belief did not come from nowhere. But I find, now, that I would rather have an honest cousin who has made mistakes than a careful one who never says anything true at all. I know why you said it. You have spent your whole life being told that beauty was the only thing you had worth trading, and it must be a bitter thing to watch a man walk past that trade for something he could not have named as valuable until he found it. Beatrice's eyes filled, and she sat down abruptly in the chair opposite, undone by a kindness she had not expected and had not, by her own reckoning, earned. I do not know how you forgive so easily. I have not forgiven easily, Margaret said. I have simply decided that carrying the weight of it does neither of us any good, and that I would rather spend what time I have left in this house being your cousin than your rival. I was never truly your rival, Beatrice. I never wanted what you wanted. I only ever wanted to be seen as a person, and it turns out that was never something you could have given me, even if you had tried, because you had not yet learned how to see it in yourself. Cecilia, listening unashamedly from the half-open door, chose that moment to enter, dropping into the window seat with her usual unceremonious directness. I have decided, she announced, that I owe you an apology also, though a smaller one, since my sins were sins of neglect rather than active unkindness, which I am told by every novel I have ever read is somehow considered a lesser crime, though I have never entirely believed it. You owe me nothing, Cecilia. I owe you 8 years of actually asking your opinion, rather than assuming I already knew it because you rarely offered one unprompted, Cecilia said. I have been quietly astonished this winter, watching you argue a boundary dispute with more precision than either the Colonel's solicitor or mine own father, and I confess I am ashamed it took a colonel falling in love with you for me to notice you had opinions worth asking for at all. Margaret laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and something in the small, sunlit morning room shifted permanently. The old architecture of the household's careless hierarchy quietly, finally dismantling itself. Chapter 8, Ashcombe Park. They married in the spring, at Thornfield Church, with no grand procession and no crowd of curious onlookers from the county, only her father at the altar, Lady Rutherford weeping happily into a handkerchief in the front pew, and both Beatrice and Cecilia standing beside Margaret at the altar rail, in matching pale green, having insisted, over Margaret's mild protests, on the honor of attending her as she had so long and so quietly attended them. Margaret wore a new gown for the occasion, pale blue rather than her customary gray, though she had insisted, over her cousin's gentle protests, on choosing it herself, without ornamentation she did not want, and on wearing her mother's small pearl brooch, the only thing she owned that had survived the accident on the Bath Road 8 years before. At Ashcombe Park, in the months that followed, she never did learn to dance a waltz. Her leg would never bear the turns, no matter how gently a partner might lead her, and she made her peace with that fact the same way she had made her peace with it 8 years before, quietly, practically, without asking anyone's permission to accept it. But every evening, when the day's business was done and the great house had settled into its particular hush, James Rutherford walked the length of whatever terrace or garden path lay nearest, at exactly her pace, his hand steady beneath her arm, Wellington trotting at their heels, and called it, without exception, the only dance he had ever wanted. Beatrice married, eventually, a baronet of modest but comfortable fortune who admired her beauty without expecting her to trade on nothing else, and who was, to everyone's quiet surprise, considerably kinder than the fortune hunters she had once so carefully cultivated. Cecilia never married at all, declaring the institution insufficiently interesting for a woman of her temperament, and instead became, over the following decades, a minor but genuinely respected authority on agricultural reform, corresponding at length with James on the subject of crop rotation, and visiting Ashcombe every summer, where she and Margaret would sit together on the terrace in companionable silence, watching the Colonel walk his slow, deliberate circuit to the garden below, and neither of them ever felt the need to fill the quiet with anything at all. And on the anniversary of the Harvest Ball each year, without fail, James brought Margaret a single potted fern for the drawing-room window, a small and private joke between them that no one else in the household ever quite understood, and that neither of them ever bothered to explain.